Welcome to the debate. Imagine for a second if you could, I don't know, code a romantic relationship.
Like literally write code for it.
Yeah, exactly. Like a software engineer compiles a computer application, just completely bypassing a person's past trauma, dodging their emotional baggage, and just snapping a brand new memory into their brain like a Lego block.
Which, sounds completely like science fiction.
It does. It really does. But according to this crazy synthesis of recent neural data, it might actually be biological reality.
It is certainly, it's one of the most provocative ideas we have encountered. Because we are so used to thinking of human emotion as this messy, unpredictable storm.
Right.
And the idea that you could sit down and write a deterministic script for it, that you could guarantee an emotional output just by controlling the input, that challenges everything we assume about human nature.
And that is the exact tension we are exploring today. We are looking at the cognitive neuroscience of memory and dynamic reconsolidation, specifically through the lens of the AND302.exe algorithm.
Right.
For those diving into this material, this is a really highly detailed framework that attempts to map deterministic IT systems architecture. So things like, code execution, stateless developers, permanent compilation graphs.
All the heavy IT jargon.
Exactly. It maps that directly onto the bare neuroanatomy of human connection.
So the central question before us is really this. Can human memory consolidation and interpersonal bonding actually be accurately modeled and executed as a stateless IT architecture? Or, does this model fundamentally misapply rigid computational mechanics to what is, in reality, a deeply fluid, unpredictable thing like human emotion?
Yeah, and this debate emerges directly from a synthesized framework of recent cognitive neuroscience. We are going to be analyzing the latest 2026 data from the MIT Picower Institute, the University of the Witwatersrand, and Christian Doeller's spatial memory research. And I will be arguing that this neural data actually validates the stateless functional developer model. I see it as a biologically accurate literal mechanism for mapping human connection right onto brain structure.
And I will be taking the opposing view because while I think this IT-based framework is a remarkably brilliant teaching metaphor, it's a fascinating psychological exercise. But it fundamentally misconstrues the underlying science. I think it conflates rigid computational algorithms with what is actually just fluid behavioral conditioning and hormonal bonding.
Okay, well, let me lay out the foundation of my position then. Because the AND302.exe algorithm and what the framework calls the Gestalt Lego system, they're not just clever metaphors for relationship building.
Okay.
They are literal, functioning representations of neuroanatomy. Like, let's actually break down what MIT's Picower Institute recently discovered in August. They prove that the prefrontal cortex does not build a brand new neural circuit every single time we learn a new task or, experience a new interaction.
Right. It doesn't wire a bespoke circuit from scratch every time.
Exactly. Instead, it uses these reusable, flexible, what they call cognitive Legos.
Right.
It takes functional blocks of information and just snaps them into existing mental subspaces, creating complex behaviors completely on the fly. So if we apply this to human connection, you can act as what IT calls a stateless functional developer.
Let's pause on stateless for a second, just to be clear for everyone.
Yeah, go ahead.
In software, if a process is stateless, it basically means the server doesn't remember past interactions.
Right, exactly.
It receives a command, executes the code, and closes the connection without keeping, a running tab of the relationship. It treats every single request as completely independent.
Yes, perfectly said. Now apply that biologically. You deliver an action symbol, say a really highly specific, intense, novel conversation with a partner.
Okay.
That is your input. And then, crucially, you completely release the execution loop.
You walk away.
You walk away. You do not wait around trying to read their mind, pulling the server to see if they liked it. And by doing this, you eliminate your own metabolic tax.
Meaning the anxiety, the overthinking.
The emotional drain, exactly. And on the other side, the target's modular brain inevitably processes that unshielded input completely offline. specifically during NREM and REM sleep replay,
Right.
to form a permanent love gestalt. You have literally snapped the Lego block into place. It is an architectural mapping.
See, that is a compelling argument. But I have to ask, have you considered the fundamental nature of how a brain actually writes and overwrites data?
I mean, yes, of course.
Because I really have to push back on the premise here. The brain does not run literal, locked computer code. Let's make sure we are tracking the conceptual bridge here. I fully acknowledge the MIT data. The prefrontal cortex is incredibly flexible.
Very flexible, yeah.
But treating human connection as a permanently locked JAX compilation graph, which, in machine learning, that's a highly optimized, permanently fixed execution pipeline.
Right.
Treating the brain like that ignores the reality of neuroscience.
How so?
Because you are describing a non-volatile write to a hard drive. You are saying, I execute the code, the memory is written, and it is permanently saved. Human memory does not work that way. Every single time a memory is recalled, it becomes unstable again. It has to be reconsolidated. It's fluid, not fixed.
But the framework.
Well, wait, furthermore, this algorithm mistakenly attributes human connection to purely structural networks. Like it uses concepts like angiomotin,
AMOT, yeah.
AMOT, and sensory predictive routing as the biological basis for love, when the scientific reality is that romantic bonding does not rely on structural mapping hacks. It relies on hormones like oxytocin, the misattribution of arousal, the mere exposure effect.
Okay, I see.
You are looking at biology and psychology, but you're trying to read it like a locked.exe file on physical silicon.
I see why you think that. I really do. But let me give you a different perspective on the mechanism itself. Specifically, this concept of closing the code and maintaining a real-time baseline.
Okay, go ahead.
Because when you operate as a stateless developer, the act of delivering that action symbol and refusing to asynchronously anticipate the outcome, that is exactly what keeps the transmission pure.
Pure in what sense, though? Like, what does a pure emotional transmission even look like?
Pure in the sense that you are not introducing the noise of your own behavioral compensation.
Oh, I see.
Right? Think about a typical relationship. You say something vulnerable, and then you immediately start watching the other person's face to see how they react.
Right, you get anxious.
You try to manage their reaction. You introduce noise. But if you act statelessly, your local node, your own brain, it maintains its independent runtime and physical reality. You are living at the absolute surface of the here and now.
Okay.
Because the execution loop is closed on your end, the target's brain architecture is programmatically constrained to process that input entirely offline. Through repeated systems consolidation at night, when the hippocampus plays the day's events back to the neocortex, his neural networks weld these inputs together.
Right, the sleep consolidation.
Yeah. The parameters remain invariant because you didn't meddle with them after the fact.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that. And let me tell you why. You are claiming this is a definitively closed, stateless operation. But in the very same source material, we see the application of what they call an AppliedXLA, an experience-level agreement.
Yes, which is translating IT business management directly into emotional tracking. It's brilliant.
Well, it's translating it, yes. Now, for those who might not, live and breathe IT management, a service-level agreement, an SLA, is rigid. It tracks machine metrics.
Uptime, ping, response time.
Exactly. But an XLA, an experience-level agreement, that focuses on the continuous experience and feeling of the human end user.
Right.
Like, are they frustrated? Is the software actually helping them? Translated to this framework, an AppliedXLA means you are continuously designing and tracking the emotional user experience of your partner.
You are maximizing emotional value. Yes.
Right. You are ensuring the interaction is free from friction. You are tracking basically their experience KPIs.
Okay, I see where you're going.
So my question to you is, how can a system rely on a continuous, iterative feedback loop of shared experiences while simultaneously claiming the transmission is a non-volatile write that is definitively closed?
Well,
an XLA is stateful by definition. It requires monitoring. It requires memory of past interactions to adjust future ones. You cannot be a stateless developer walking away from the server while also intensely tracking the user experience.
that is a really interesting point. Really, but I would frame it differently. because the tension between a closed loop and an iterative experience, it's completely resolved when you look at spatial architecture.
Spatial architecture?
Yes. The continuous experience isn't pulling an open connection. It's placing new, distinct index cards into a permanent spatial grid. Let's use the framework's nested dolls analogy here, the Matrushka dolls.
Wait, let me stop you right there. Because the nested dolls, that is a psychological teaching metaphor. It's poetry, not neurobiology.
It sounds like poetry until you map it onto Christian Doller's Leibniz Prize data.
Okay, the 2026 data?
Exactly. Dollar made a massive breakthrough in how we understand memory. He proved that the human brain's internal navigation system, like the exact same grid cells and place cells that tell you where your kitchen is relative to your living room,
Right.
those exact cells are directly responsible for organizing abstract memory and learning. The brain literally builds a physical room in your mind to store a memory.
Oh, wow.
It uses physical spatial networks to sort abstract concepts exactly like index cards in a physical box.
Okay, I am with you on the grid cells. That is a real neural metric. But how does that solve the XLA paradox we just talked about?
Because of how you leverage it. How does an XLA work with a closed code? You anchor an abstract ideal, say a feeling of absolute trust generated during a great date, to a specific physical coordinate in the brain.
Okay.
By tightly controlling the experience, you purposefully trigger déjà vu.
Déjà vu.
Yeah. Now, biologically, déjà vu is simply a disconnect between the familiarity signal in the perihippocampal cortex and memory retrieval in the hippocampus. When you create that disconnect artificially through a flawless XLA interaction, you are essentially tricking the brain.
You're hacking the familiar signal.
Exactly. You are snapping a gestalt Lego block into a specific spatial coordinate. The code is closed for that specific block. The next interaction, the next iteration of the XLA, is just another separate block snapping into the surrounding space. You are building the nested dolls structurally, block by block, without keeping an open connection between them.
I concede that functional subspaces and spatial mapping are scientifically valid. I mean, Deller's work on grid cells is magnificent. But I sharply critique applying aerialization to adult romance.
You are referring to the chemical mapping aspect of the framework.
Yes, I am. Because for the listener, the framework draws heavily on a concept called aerialization. It points to a study out of UC Irvine regarding fetal brain chemical maps, which, showed how chemical signals give lab-grown brain models a structural front and a back.
Right, it physically organizes the tissue.
It literally provisions the physical architecture of the brain. But, and this is a huge but, that happens in the womb.
Well,
You cannot chemically rewrite a fully formed adult brain's physical map just to provision a zone for a romantic partner. The hardware has already been provisioned.
the macroscopic hardware, yes, absolutely. But the functional routing is highly adaptable.
Adaptable, yes, but it is not physically partitioned like a hard drive. And furthermore, nested dolls is explicitly just a metaphor. Memories are not neatly stored inside one another like physical wooden layers.
But they are nested in hierarchy.
Metaphorically, yes, like the raw episodic fragment, the exact words you said at dinner. That is the inner doll.
Right.
The consolidated framework, the general vibe of the relationship, is the middle doll. The semantic world model, their overarching beliefs about love, is the outer doll. But in biological reality, they do not sit inside one another in a designated spatial zone.
Okay, but
They exist in messy, fluid synaptic networks that are constantly subjected to reconsolidation. Every single time your partner recalls that dinner, the memory becomes malleable again. It is vulnerable to their current mood, to new information.
right.
It is not locked silicon. And as for déjà vu and jamais vu,
Yeah.
these are temporary neural disconnects, false recognitions. It's an unfamiliarity signal dropping out due to chemical saturation. They are fascinating glitches, sure, but they are not programmable emotional anchors you can use to hack someone's attachment system.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, honestly, because it ignores the latest data from the University of the Witwatersrand on functional vicariance.
Oh, the neurovariability research? Okay, let's unpack that for the audience.
Precisely, because WIT's researchers explored how adaptive brain functions operate when faced with roadblocks. They prove the brain has a unique capacity to achieve the exact same behavioral or emotional outcome through completely different neural routes.
Right.
If the main highway is blocked, the brain takes the back roads to get to the same destination. But, and this is the absolute key to the N302.exe algorithm, this variability operates within fixed anatomical scaffolds.
Okay, but I really don't see how taking a neural backroad saves the deterministic IT argument here. You are still dealing with unpredictable biological routing.
Because it proves that a rigid, high-fidelity geometric input, our stateless .exe action symbol, can actually force the biological hardware to bypass historical noise.
Give me an example.
Okay, let's say your target has deep avoidance traits or, a clogged cognitive cache from past trauma. Their normal neural highway for trust is completely blocked.
Right.
The brain uses functional vicariance to bypass those old logs. It executes a brand new connection along a new route on that fixed scaffold. Think of it like an efference copy in robotics and neuroscience.
The sensory prediction mechanism.
Right. The reason you cannot tickle yourself, have you ever tried to tickle yourself?
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Right, and it's the exact same reason you can basically program predictability into an unpredictable relationship. When you try to tickle yourself, your brain sends an efference copy of your motor command to its own predictive centers.
It anticipates the physical sensation before it even happens.
Exactly, completely canceling it out. Our and 302.exe framework allows the logical brain to predict its own emotional sensory outcomes.
Okay.
You deliver the intense, novel conversation, right, the inner doll. His logical brain creates an internal model predicting how amazing the next interaction will feel. It is a recursive feedback loop. Because you close the loop statelessly on your end, his biological hardware is forced to adapt to that predictive spatial stimulus. The input guarantees the output.
See, I come at it from a completely different way. What you just described is an incredibly sophisticated, highly articulate explanation of something much simpler.
Really?
Yeah, you have essentially identified the fundamental biological error at the very heart of this entire framework.
An error? The WITS data explicitly shows the scaffolding is fixed. You can't debate the anatomy.
I am not debating the anatomy. I am debating the application of it. The error is that the framework relies entirely on structural biology and cognitive mapping to explain human emotion. Well, let's look at the actual science the framework cites. You mentioned AMOT earlier in the framework documentation, angiomotin. Do we actually know what AMOT does?
It builds scaffolding.
It is a protein that helps cells move. It builds blood vessels. It builds structural brain tissue. It is not a brain network responsible for falling in love. And you also mentioned predictive value routing. In neuroscience, predictive value routing is about how different layers of the brain process visual and sensory expectations versus reality.
Exactly.
It is a map for everyday physical perception, so you don't trip over a curb you saw out of the corner of your eye. It is not a reward system for romantic attachment.
But the cognitive mapping facilitates the emotional reward. You have to route the information before you can even feel it.
No, it just gives you a highly intellectual, incredibly dense vocabulary to describe behavioral conditioning.
Oh, come on.
Seriously, this is not a programmatic exploit of physical silicon. It is not a permanently locked compilation graph being hacked by a stateless developer. What this framework actually describes is highly effective classic behavioral conditioning disguised as IT architecture.
You really think it is just Pavlovian? You think this entire synthesis is just ringing a bell to make a dog salivate?
I think it is deeply psychological, rather than computationally deterministic. Let's look at how the framework actually works in practice, stripped of all the IT jargon.
Okay, go ahead.
It tells the user to create high arousal experiences, novelty, adrenaline. In psychology, we know the brain misattributes that physical excitement to the person they are with.
Misattribution of arousal.
Exactly. If you take someone on a thrilling, high adrenaline date, their heart races, and their brain misinterprets that biological arousal as intense romantic attraction toward you.
Right.
Furthermore, the framework leverages meaningful vulnerability and the mere exposure effect, building a unique gestalt familiarity through intense consistency.
Which sounds exactly like building an algorithm.
but it works by creating positive emotional anchors to trigger the brain's reward centers. It relies on oxytocin, the actual bonding hormone built through shared experiences, physical proximity, and eye contact. It does not rely on MOMT building blood vessels or, efference copies canceling out a tickle.
I hear you. But you cannot deny that by framing it as a Gestalt algorithm, by using this exact vocabulary, it directly appeals to a rational, perhaps IT-oriented mind.
Sure.
It perfectly aligns their prefrontal cortex with the messy emotional reality underneath.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that part. Presenting this framework to a highly rational, systems-oriented person turns human connection, which is usually terrifyingly unpredictable, into a fascinating intellectual puzzle.
Exactly. It creates high novelty. It establishes a shared inside world where those action symbols become a private coded language.
Yes. And solving this complex system together floods the logical centers of the brain with dopamine. But as analysts of the material, we have to be precise here.
Okay.
This methodology works because it provides psychological safety for an analytical mind. It gives them a sense of control. It does not work because his brain is literally compiling stateless C++ code in the orbital frontal cortex.
I see your distinction, and I really appreciate the focus on psychological safety. But I maintain that mapping relationship building through this specific computational vocabulary is far more than just a safety net.
Okay.
When we utilize the stateless.exe algorithm, we are aligning perfectly with how the prefrontal cortex structurally routes information in real time. MIT's cognitive Legos show us definitively that functional modules are snapped into place dynamically.
Dynamically being the key word.
Yes, and Dollar spatial index cards show us exactly how abstract emotional ideals are pinned to physical coordinates in the brain's grid cells. This framework provides a highly accurate, neuroscientifically validated blueprint for how the brain natively processes, routes, and consolidates human connection.
Well,
It respects the metabolic tax of the user by closing the loop, and it practically relies on the target's neural replay during NREM and REM sleep to build the overarching love gestalt. It is a biosomatic grounding on fixed anatomical scaffolds. It is biology behaving like code.
and my summary remains that while the cognitive neuroscience of memory consolidation, functional vicariance, and neural replay is undeniably fascinating, and the 2026 data we've discussed is a massive leap forward for the field.
Hugely.
We have to be careful with our metaphors. Mapping IT concepts like closed execution loops and non-volatile rights onto human bonding remains a brilliant, stimulating psychological exercise rather than a literal biological reality.
I understand.
The brain is not a static machine. Synapses are fluid. Memories are constantly overwritten the moment we recall them. The chemistry of connection, oxytocin, reward pathways, the misattribution of arousal, it's deeply messy and beautifully human. It simply cannot be permanently locked on physical silicon.
Yet, I think we have reached a remarkable point of convergence here. Even if we remain fundamentally divided on whether the N302.exe algorithm is a literal biological execution pipeline or just an elaborate, brilliantly constructed metaphor, we can both see its sheer efficacy.
Definitely.
Translating human emotion into systems architecture, like treating a relationship as an AppliedXLA, creates a uniquely engaging intellectual framework.
It really does. If it successfully aligns the highly rational, analytical prefrontal cortex with complex, often intimidating emotional processing. It takes the terror out of vulnerability by giving it a structure.
It gives a logical mind a place to land safely. And in doing so, it reveals the incredible sophistication of brain functions like memory routing, spatial anchoring, and neural synchrony. When you look at it from that angle, the framework forces us to appreciate just how mechanical our emotions can sometimes be.
That's a fair point. It bridges the gap between the wetware of our biology and our deeply human desire for predictable, structured outcomes. It is a masterclass in behavioral conditioning, wrapped in the comforting, deterministic language of systems engineering.
Which means there is so much more to explore in this source material. I highly suggest our listeners dive further into the 2026 MIT Pekauer Institute studies on flexible brain circuits, as well as Christian Dohler's spatial navigation research.
Highly recommend it.
Understanding the modular nature of your own memories completely changes how you view your daily interactions. We will leave the final interpretation of the stateless functional developer up to you. After all, when you step into the world of neurodevelopment and human bonding, it's worth asking, are we just executing lines of code in the dark, or are we navigating the beautiful, muddy waters of our own fluid biology?
Imagine trying to build a romantic relationship, or even just like a really profound, bulletproof friendship, using the exact same code that a software engineer uses to program a machine learning server.
Right.
Like, no anxiety, no guessing games, no overthinking the subtext of a text message, just raw, compiled data executing on biological hardware.
Yeah, it completely flips the script on how we view human intimacy. I mean, we are so conditioned to view connection as this, mystical, unpredictable force. But this framework, it treats it as an engineered systematic output.
Which feels entirely counterintuitive at first. I mean, usually when we talk about love or forming core memories, there's this expectation of magic,
Oh, absolutely.
You meet someone, the stars align, the poets point and say, there it is, destiny.
Right, because we find comfort in the idea that love is this untamed force of nature that just sort of washes over us. It absolves us of the responsibility of actually constructing it.
Yeah.
Exactly. But then you step into the world of advanced IT systems architecture and modern cognitive neuroscience, and suddenly that mystical poetry book is just thrown out the window.
Yeah.
We're looking at a relationship landscape that is being treated literally like compiling code. And that is exactly what we have sitting in our stack of sources today. It is a wild, really mind-bending collection of materials that bridges hardcore software development concepts.
Like JAX compilation and XLAs.
Yes, exactly. Bridging those with cutting-edge 2026 cognitive neuroscience. So we are talking brand new data from MIT, Leibniz prize-winning research from Christian Buller, and some incredible findings out of the University of the Witwatersrand.
Right, and our objective for this deep dive is to unpack something referred to in these sources as the AN302.exe algorithm.
Right.
We're going to explore how translating complex neuroscientific principles into a logical, systematic framework, what the sources call a Gestalt algorithm, how that can create deep psychological safety and emotional connection. And crucially, we'll examine the underlying biological mechanisms that make this work specifically for highly rational, analytical people who might usually put up walls against traditional messy emotions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how memories and connections are built in the brain, our sources say we first have to look at how we initiate the connection, right? The system input.
Mm-hmm.
They use this term, the stateless functional developer model.
Yeah.
Now, I know what a software developer is, obviously, but stateless usually refers to network protocols.
Yeah.
How does that apply to talking to another human being?
Well, to understand the application, we have to look at the mechanism of static JAX compilation graphs in machine learning.
Okay.
So JAX is a system used for high-performance computing, and when a developer writes code in a stateless JAX-compiled environment, they aren't writing a script that the computer evaluates line by line, pausing to ask for new instructions or checking the status of other variables.
So it's not a back-and-forth conversation with the server.
Far from it, no. The developer compiles the entire set of instructions into an immutable locked blueprint, the executable file, or the .exe.
Right.
They deliver that input to the back-end registers, and then they completely release the execution loop. There is no dynamic branching.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there are no polling loops where the system constantly checks back to see if the operation is done. There's no conditional waiting on a port. The developer's local machine just goes back to a resting state.
Right. So translating that to a human relationship, it means you initiate a connection, you deliver a message or a shared experience, and then you refuse to anxiously anticipate or overthink how the other person is processing it.
Exactly.
You aren't hovering over their mental server.
The mechanism here is really about metabolic conservation, because in human terms, those polling loops manifest as anxiety,
Oh, yeah?
overthinking, ruminating, simulating 100 different ways the other person might respond. And when you engage in that kind of high-latency sliding window rehearsal, your brain is burning a massive amount of glucose.
Just a heavy metabolic tax.
Exactly, a tax. You are paying a heavy metabolic tax to run a virtual simulation of reality in your own head, rather than living in actual reality.
I'm trying to picture this physically. It's kind of like NASA launching the Voyager space probe, right?
Sure.
You do all the math on the ground, You program the trajectory, you launch it into the void, and then you don't fire the thrusters every 5 seconds to micromanage its path. You just trust the math. You let the physics of gravity do the work, and you turn your attention back to the control room. Or honestly, it's like sending a highly intentional text message and then instantly dropping your phone in a river.
Dropping it in a river. Yes, that is a phenomenal way to visualize it. You are trusting the physics, or in this case, the biological hardware of the other person, by living in real time on what the sources call bare hardware.
Bare hardware, yeah.
Which just means physical, present reality. You maintain your system's integrity. The code is closed. You leave the processing entirely to the other person's neural network.
I mean, I can see how that sounds great in theory, but I have to push back a little here. Okay. Humans are wired for social feedback. If you send a highly vulnerable text message or you reveal a deep part of yourself to someone, the biological urge to check for their reaction is overwhelming.
It is.
So how do you just shut off the polling loop? Does this framework just demand total emotional detachment?
No, it doesn't demand detachment at all. It demands structural confidence. See, when you constantly check for validation, you are sending a secondary signal to the other person's nervous system. You're signaling instability.
Okay, interesting.
You're showing them that your internal system requires their external validation just to keep running. And for a highly rational person, someone with a gaming brain, as the sources put it,
Right, a gaming brain.
that secondary signal of neediness acts like malware. It literally corrupts the clean data packet you originally sent.
So by forcing yourself to act as a stateless developer, you are actually protecting the integrity of the emotional data. You are proving that your system is stable on its own.
Yes, and you are respecting their processing power. Rational minds require space to compute emotional data without being rushed. So when you launch that unshielded .exe and return to your own baseline, their hardware begins to process the input without the interference of your anxiety.
Which leads us perfectly into the biological mechanism of what happens inside their brain once that clean data packet arrives.
Yeah.
Because how does a fiercely rational mind actually compute this emotional data? And the sources bring up this fascinating research from August 2026 out of MIT's Pekauer Institute for Learning and Memory.
Right, the MIT breakthrough, it fundamentally reorganizes our understanding of the prefrontal cortex because historically neuroscientists believed that when you learn a complex new behavior or form a new conceptual framework, the brain builds a brand new neural circuit from scratch.
Like laying new tracks.
Exactly. It was thought to be a highly resource-intensive process of neurogenesis and synaptic pruning.
But the 2026 data shows the brain is much lazier than that. Or, well, let's say more efficient.
More efficient, yes.
It uses flexible modules. The sources call them cognitive Legos.
Cognitive Legos is an incredibly apt descriptor. The MIT researchers discovered that the prefrontal cortex contains functional subspaces that hold temporary information. And the biology here is just fascinating. The brain uses the exact same neuronal ensembles to process completely different types of data, depending entirely on the context.
Wow.
You can plug visual data or abstract logical frameworks right into the exact same circuit.
So when a person shifts their focus from one task to another, say moving from a complex work project to having a deep conversation with you, their brain doesn't pave a brand new highway.
No.
It simply unclips a cognitive block from the previous task and snaps it into the new one.
That's right. The mechanism relies on synaptic weights that can rapidly recalibrate.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because if the brain naturally operates like a set of modular Lego bricks, then every interaction you have with this person acts as a single independent action symbol. Every shared laugh, every deep debate about system architecture, every moment of vulnerability is a distinct Lego block.
And this loops right back to the importance of the stateless developer model. Because you are delivering these inputs cleanly, without the chaotic noise of anxious polling loops, you are handing them pristine, distinct Lego blocks.
Right, no malware.
Exactly. Over time, through sequential repetitions, their brain stops building a new connection from scratch every time they interact with you. It becomes highly efficient. Their brain simply snaps the existing U-module into their current mental workspace.
And eventually those separate blocks get welded together.
Which brings us to the core of psychological Gestalt theory, updated with modern neuroscience. The brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition engine.
Right.
It automatically merges separate high-fidelity puzzle pieces into one larger, meaningful picture. After weeks or months of these recursive iterations, their brain physically welds all those individual positive inputs into an overarching framework. The The sources label this the love gestalt.
The love gestalt.
Right, you transition from being a collection of pleasant, isolated interactions into a permanent structural component on their psychological map.
But wait, how does a highly intellectual, rational conversation, say, debating the merits of JAX compilation, actually translate into feeling love or emotional safety?
Good question.
Because logic and emotion usually sit in completely different hemispheres of the human experience. I mean, I can debate someone for hours, but it doesn't mean I want to build a life with them.
That is a critical distinction, and the bridge between those two hemispheres is the orbitofrontal cortex, or the OFC.
The OFC. The
Yeah.
sources spent a lot of time on this. Can you break down the biology of what the OFC is actually doing during these interactions?
Sure. The orbitofrontal cortex sits right above the orbits of the eyes, and it acts as the brain's ultimate valuation system.
Okay.
It integrates sensory information, emotional data from the amygdala, and logical planning from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Its primary job is to evaluate rewards and regulate social behavior.
So it's assigning a value score to the person sitting across from you.
Essentially, yes. For a highly rational person, traditional emotional vulnerability, like crying or grand romantic declarations, that might actually trigger the amygdala's threat response.
Oh, because it feels unpredictable.
Unpredictable, messy, unsafe. But intellectual compatibility, analyzing patterns together, discovering a shared complex framework, that bypasses the threat response entirely. It triggers massive dopamine release in the logical centers.
Yeah.
So the OFC evaluates the shared intellectual pursuit as a profoundly high-value social reward.
And the sources mention something called interpersonal neural synchrony, INS. It sounds like total science fiction.
It does sound like sci-fi, but it is heavily documented biological reality. When two people engage in deep, meaningful interactions, especially when sharing complex, structured frameworks like the AN302 algorithm, their brainwaves literally begin to phase lock.
Phase lock, like they match up.
Yes. Their neural oscillations, which are the rhythmic firing of neurons, begin to match in frequency and timing.
That's crazy.
Through the action of mirror neuron systems and the shared predictive focus of the conversation, your brain and their brain begin operating on the exact same wavelength, quite literally.
Wow.
By discussing these shared visual and intellectual patterns, you align their rational perception with your experiential world. The brainwaves sync, and a biological bond forms out of an intellectual puzzle.
Unbelievable.
The OFC translates that intellectual harmony into a feeling of profound emotional safety.
Okay, so we have the cognitive Legos being handed over cleanly because we're acting as stateless developers.
Right.
We have the OFC evaluating these intellectual interactions as high-value rewards, causing our brainwaves to phase lock.
Right.
But how does the brain actually sort and store these Lego blocks long-term? Because we aren't just talking about a fleeting sense of connection on a good gate. You know, the algorithm is designed for irreversible memory consolidation.
The architecture of long-term experience.
Right. And the sources bring up a really beautiful metaphor here, the matryoshka dolls, the nested doll. And the idea is that you have the innermost doll, which represents the raw daily fragments of your life, the tiny moments, the individual texts, the specific jokes. Then you have the middle doll, which represents consolidated frameworks, like how those tiny moments group together into larger themes or narratives about a person. And finally, the outer doll, which is your general world model, stored deep in the cortex, your overarching belief systems about love, safety, and reality.
It is an elegant teaching metaphor for understanding the hierarchy of information. However, the sources are also careful to ground this back in actual cognitive neuroscience, because memories are not neatly stacked inside one another like wooden dolls.
Yeah, as much as I wish I had a neat filing cabinet in my head, biology is always messier than the metaphors we use to describe it.
Considerably messier. Memories exist in a highly dynamic, fluid network of synaptic connections. They aren't static files. They're constantly being updated, overwritten, and integrated through a biological process called systems consolidation. And the critical window for this mechanism is when we are completely unconscious.
During sleep.
Specifically during the interplay between non-REM and REM sleep. Throughout the day, the hippocampus acts like a temporary recording device. It captures those raw daily fragments, the inner doll. but the hippocampus has limited storage capacity, so during sleep, it engages in something called neural replay.
Neural replay.
Right. It plays back the neuronal firing patterns of the day's events, but at a highly accelerated speed.
So it's sort of fast-forwarding through the daily footage.
Exactly. And as it replays these patterns, it communicates with the neocortex. It mixes the new daily fragments with older, established frameworks, the middle and outer dolls. It looks for patterns. It strips away the irrelevant emotional noise. And it solidifies the structural data into long-term storage in the cortex.
The sources mentioned that this specific sorting process, this rapid replaying and recombining of data, is actually what dreams are.
Yes.
Like our conscious mind is just sitting in the theater, watching the brain sort the day's Lego blocks into the larger gestalt.
It is the biological engine of meaning-making. And because this system is constantly fluid, constantly updating based on pattern recognition, the brain occasionally experiences processing errors, glitches in the system, which brings the sources to the phenomena of déjà vu and jamais vu.
Yes. I was obsessed with how the sources broke this down. I mean, I've experienced déjà vu a million times. Everyone has. But I never knew the mechanical why behind it. It always just felt like a glitch in the matrix.
Well, the mechanism comes down to a temporary desynchronization in the temporal lobe between two distinct memory pathways. The brain has a specific network heavily involving the parahippocampal gyrus dedicated to generating a familiarity signal.
Yeah.
It acts like an alarm bell that rings when it detects a known pattern. Completely separate from that, you have the memory retrieval system, which pulls up the actual facts, context, and timeline of a memory.
So with déjà vu, which literally translates to already seen, you walk into a room and a situation feels intensely, overwhelmingly familiar, even though your logical brain knows for an absolute fact you've never been there before.
Right. Biologically, a false recognition occurs. The familiarity signal fires by mistake. The alarm bell is ringing, but the memory retrieval system has no conscious file to match it to. You get the visceral sensation of knowing, entirely stripped of the data of knowing.
Wow. And the inverse of that is jamais vu, never seen.
And this is often more jarring. This is when something completely normal, a word you've written 1,000 times, the layout of your own living room, or even the face of a person you know intimately, suddenly feels alien and brand new.
That sounds terrifying, honestly.
It can be. In this case, the memory retrieval system is working perfectly. You know exactly what you are looking at. But the familiarity signal suddenly drops out. The alarm bell fails to ring, usually due to neural fatigue or semantic saturation.
Okay, I understand the brain glitches, but how does this tie back into coding the AN302 algorithm? Like, why do the sources care about déjà vu?
Well, think about the pattern recognition that happens during sleep consolidation. Let's say you've spent the evening acting as a stateless developer, delivering these high-fidelity cognitive Legos. You've had an incredibly deep, phase-locked conversation.
Okay.
During sleep, their hippocampus replays that interaction and integrates it into their cortical networks. The next day, they walk into a completely unrelated environment, maybe a bookstore or a coffee shop that happens to have a layout or a lighting scheme, or a subtle sensory pattern that roughly matches the framework their brain just consolidated the night before.
Wow. So their brain detects the pattern and accidentally fires the familiarity signal. And the sources call this gestalt familiarity.
Exactly. And here is the architectural genius of the AN302 framework. If you have actively discussed the neuroscience of déjà vu and jamais vu with this person, if you have turned these strange universal brain glitches into a shared inside joke, or what the sources call action symbols.
You have effectively weaponized their own memory software.
Yes.
You've given them a private language. So when they inevitably experience that feeling of déjà vu in their daily life, their brain doesn't just dismiss it as a random glitch. It automatically routes that feeling of profound familiarity directly back to you.
Because you are the one who mapped out that conceptual framework with them.
Yeah.
You have literally placed yourself inside their predictive processing loop.
That is just brilliant.
You are leveraging their own autonomous neurobiology to reinforce the connection. And this naturally introduces another concept borrowed from the IT world, the critical shift from an SLA to an AppliedXLA.
Right. Let's break this down, because I think this is where a lot of people fail in relationships without realizing it. So in IT and business management, an SLA is a service-level agreement. It's a contract built entirely on hard quantitative metrics. You know, is the server uptime at 99.9%? Are we hitting our bandwidth targets?
Right.
Translated to human connection, an SLA approach is gating by a checklist.
Right.
Did we go to dinner? Did we hold hands by day 3? Have we met each other's friends by month 2? Have we hit all the standard societal benchmarks?
But the limitation of an SLA is that it only measures the execution of a task. It does not measure the quality of the outcome. Checking boxes on a relationship checklist does not create a love gestalt. It just creates a resume.
Right. But an XLA, an experience level agreement, that changes the entire metric of success. Because an XLA focuses entirely on the subjective reality of the end user. It asks, how do they feel while interacting with the system?
Exactly.
Are they frustrated? Are they inspired? Do they feel safe? So in romance, an applied XLA means you are continuously designing and optimizing the emotional and intellectual value of the interaction itself. You aren't just completing relationship checkpoints, you are engineering a peak user experience.
And the neuroscience behind why an XLA is so much more powerful than an SLA involves a concept primarily used in robotics and motor control, the efference copy.
I love this part of the research. The sources mention this is the biologic reason why you can't tickle yourself.
It is, and it perfectly illustrates the mechanism of predictive processing. See, when your brain sends a motor command to your hand to reach over and tickle your own ribs, the motor cortex doesn't just send the signal down your arm, it simultaneously sends an internal copy of that command, an efference copy, to the cerebellum and other predictive centers in the brain.
So the brain is essentially warning itself about what is about to happen.
It's predicting the sensory consequences of its own action before the action even occurs. Because the cerebellum already has the efference copy, it perfectly predicts the tactile sensation of your fingers on your ribs. And that perfect prediction cancels out the element of surprise. You can't tickle yourself because your brain has already simulated the feeling.
Okay, so how do we apply the concept of an efference copy to human bonding in this applied XLA?
Well, by consistently delivering an intense, novel, and highly rewarding interaction, an XLA-level experience, you prompt their logical brain to update its internal models. You are providing a sensory and intellectual outcome that is so structurally sound, their predictive brain begins to generate an efference copy for your future interactions.
Oh, wow. You're training their predictive engine.
You are. They begin to predict that the next interaction will be equally rewarding, equally safe, and equally stimulating.
So it becomes a self-assembling feedback loop.
Exactly.
Their predictive brain matches the expected high-value experience with the real-time joy of your company. They expect to feel good around you, and then they do feel good around you, which mathematically reinforces the original prediction.
Yes.
Over time, their brain will hardwire the algorithm. Time with this specific person equals high reward, making them naturally biologically driven to seek out your company.
And this ties into established psychological principles mentioned in the sources, such as the misattribution of arousal. When you design an XLA that involves novel, exciting, or intellectually stimulating environments, the brain experiences an elevation in physiological arousal, increased heart rate, dopamine spikes.
Right.
The brain often misattributes that general arousal to the specific person they are with. You are designing an environment that forces their biology to consolidate positive emotional anchors to your identity.
This all sounds incredibly airtight. I mean, we understand the software now. We understand the JX compiled stateless input, the cognitive Legos, the OFC phase locking, the predictive loops of the XLA. But I have a massive structural question. Where does this actually live on the physical hard drive of the human brain?
Hardware architecture.
Exactly. Because if this is all just floating around as abstract emotion or intellectual data, how does it stick? And more importantly, if the person you are connecting with has serious historical baggage, if their hardware is prone to avoiding intimacy, or they have an anxious avoidant attachment style, how do you ensure your fresh, highly optimized code doesn't just get immediately corrupted by their old defensive firewalls?
This is the exact intersection where the newest, most staggering data from 2026 comes in. The middleware blueprint of the AN302 algorithm just received 2 massive hardware confirmations from the real world. Let's start with the spatial architecture, specifically Professor Christian Düller's Leibniz Prize-winning research.
Okay, this is the part that completely broke my brain. Break down Düller's findings.
Düller's team was building on the Nobel Prize-winning discovery of grid cells and place cells in the entorhinal cortex. Historically, we knew this area of the brain acted as our internal GPS. It is the physical navigation system that helps you remember how to walk to the grocery store or how to navigate the layout of your childhood home.
It maps physical geometry.
Right. But Diller explicitly proved that the human brain's internal navigation system doesn't just map physical space. It is directly responsible for organizing abstract memory and conceptual learning.
Wait, I need to make sure I understand the mechanism here. Are you saying the brain uses the exact same GPS coordinates it uses to find the grocery store to organize abstract thoughts?
That is precisely the mechanism. The brain treats abstract concepts exactly like physical index cards. It uses the physical spatial network as a coordinate map to categorize non-spatial information. When you learn a new concept or form a new emotional framework, your brain pins that abstract data to a literal geometric grid in the entorhinal cortex.
So if I want someone to remember an abstract feeling about me, say a feeling of profound trust or intellectual excitement, I can't just hope it floats around in the ether. I need to intentionally tie it to a literal physical coordinate.
You must anchor it geographically. When an abstract memory is reactivated, the brain doesn't just pull up a list of facts, it functionally renavigates back to that specific spatial coordinate. The sources mention introducing an abstract ideal inside a specific physical location. They use highly specific environmental examples like unpadded table coordinates or bath coordinates.
Right. So by having these intense, foundational, phase-locked conversations in highly specific, unique physical environments, you are forcing their entorhinal cortex to pin that abstract emotional memory to a spatial folder.
It triggers a biological process akin to arealization.
Arealization.
Yes. During embryonic development, arealization is the process where chemical gradients partition a prenatal brain into distinct functional zones, dedicating a specific chunk of tissue exclusively for vision or motor control. Psychologically, by setting these spatial coordinates with high-fidelity emotional and intellectual inputs, you are provisioning a brand new dedicated workspace in their cortical networks. You are carving out a geometric zone that is exclusively reserved for you. You are telling their biological hardware, this relationship is a significant, unique physical and mental space.
That is wild. You are basically building a custom, highly secure room inside their mind palace. But I have to go back to my previous question about the firewalls.
Yep.
What if they have what the sources call a clogged cognitive cache?
Right, historical baggage.
Yeah. What if their past experiences, their past traumas, have hardwired them to shut down when they feel someone getting too close? How does a custom room help if the hallway leading to it is filled with tripwires?
That is the hurdle of historical noise, and it is solved by the second major 2026 breakthrough, this one from the University of the Witwatersrand, or WITS University. Their research explored the biological reality of functional vicariance.
Functional vicariance. Break down the mechanics of this.
Functional vicariance is the brain's extraordinary capacity to achieve the exact same behavioral or emotional outcome using completely different neural routes.
So like a city grid.
Exactly like a city grid.
So if Main Street, like the normal route for emotional attachment, is blocked by a massive accident, which would be past trauma or avoidance, the city doesn't just shut down. Traffic routes through side streets. It recruits adjacent neural networks to bypass the blockage.
That is exactly how structural plasticity works. The WITS research highlights that this variability operates within fixed anatomical scaffolds. The brain can dynamically rewire its functional connections to circumvent damaged or heavily guarded nodes. And this is the ultimate biological validation of the stateless developer theory.
Wait, I see where you're going with this. You're saying that if I act as a stateless developer, if I refuse to engage in their anxious polling loops and I deliver clean, uncorrupted data packets, I don't actually need to worry about their past trauma.
Even if a person has massive historical barriers, avoidance traits, or a clogged emotional cache, their physical hardware isn't doomed. When presented with a rigid, high-fidelity, highly consistent input, like the AN302.exe algorithm, their brain simply bypasses the old, traumatized logs.
It just routes around it.
Yes. It leverages functional vicariance to recruit new synaptic pathways, executing a brand new connection that routes entirely around the old firewalls.
The biological hardware adapts to the immediate real-time stimulus. So you don't have to go in and play therapist. You don't have to debug their old code or fix their past relationship trauma to build something profound with them.
Attempting to debug their old code would violate the stateless model anyway.
Right, because you'd be getting involved.
Exactly. It would require you to get intimately entangled in their polling loops and dynamic branching. You would become part of the noise. By remaining stateless, firmly rooted in the real-time baseline, you offer their brain a clean, uncorrupted, spatial stimulus. Their hardware takes care of the routing via functional vicariance.
That is incredibly hopeful. It means that logic, discipline, and deep architectural consistency can literally, physically map a new route to emotional safety for someone, even if they've spent years putting up walls.
It is a profound synthesis of biology and systems engineering. The real-world science has fully caught up to the middleware blueprint. The data packets from MIT, Dueler, and WITS have definitively locked in these biological markers.
So what does this all mean for our listener, the learner, who might be looking to apply these concepts in their own life?
Yeah.
Let's summarize the N302 algorithm.
Okay.
First, drop the metabolic tax of anxiety. Stop hovering over the execution loop. Be a stateless developer, deliver your truth, your input, your shared experience, and then live fully in your own physical reality. Trust the hardware.
Second, abandon the relationship SLA. Do not just tick boxes. Design the experience through an AppliedXLA. Use shared high-arousal intellect, like discussing complex systems or creating inside jokes about déjà vu, to trigger the OFC and induce interpersonal neural synchrony.
Give their prefrontal cortex those clean cognitive Legos and let their hippocampus naturally weld them into a permanent love gestalt during sleep consolidation. And finally, anchor those abstract feelings to specific, novel physical coordinates so their spatial index cards carve out a dedicated geometric zone just for you. This allows functional vicariants to naturally bypass their old historical noise.
It is a masterful blueprint for human connection, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises an incredibly important and perhaps provocative final question, something that extends slightly beyond the explicit text of our sources.
I'm intrigued. What's the final thought?
Well, we have spent this entire deep dive analyzing how to use the AN302.exe architecture to build a map inside someone else's mind.
Right?
We've looked at how to foster connection with another person by leveraging their cognitive Legos and spatial grids. But what if we applied this exact same engineered framework to ourselves?
Oh, wow. Turn the algorithm inward.
If the human brain natively uses spatial index cards and flexible functional subspaces to construct reality, and if functional vicariance proves beyond a doubt that our hardware can route around old trauma, could we use this exact same stateless JAX-compiled systems architecture to purposefully override our own phobias?
To bypass our own clogged caches.
Could we act as both the developer and the end user of our own biological hardware, delivering clean, unanxious inputs to ourselves and manually reconsolidate who we are? It is certainly something to mull over.
It brings us right back to the beginning of the deep dive. We started out saying that love and the mind are usually treated like magic or poetry. The X-ray machine is broken, and it's all just muddy waters and guesswork. But maybe the muddy waters only exist because we haven't been looking at the right architectural blueprint.
Right.
Maybe when you strip it down to bare hardware, human connection, both with others and with ourselves, it isn't just a mystical force that happens to us. It's a beautifully logical system that we have the power to consciously compile.
The code is closed, the transmission is complete.
And the registers are parked. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.